Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Mutual Aid Podcast. I'm your co-host, Ayman,
And I'm Israa.
and today we're going to do an episode on what is mutual aid. And we're going to be focusing, initially we were thinking of focusing on either theory or practice, but when we were planning and preparing for this episode, we found it very difficult to separate those two when it comes to mutual aid. So we might talk a little bit about why we decided to do that before then going into what is mutual aid. I think that's a very important question to frame this whole project because I think there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of lack of understanding, and yeah, a lot of usefulness to just being a bit concrete and exploring this question, the definition, as practice and as a theory for for a couple of reasons to illuminate the work we do, the work that we see around us, the valuable things that we see happening through mutual aid, and potentially as a resource for other people coming into mutual aid or the like. So, yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about our thinking about the framing of this episode?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, as you said, we're sitting there thinking about theory, and uh, the theory and the practice feels very intertwined. For me, the theory is a study of the actual practice, right? Um, on face value, mutual aid looks very simple. It's people showing up together uh, and practicing collective well-being. But how do you actually do that? And how does that make it different than charity or aid or all these other um, mechanisms in the system that essentially look the same? And especially at a time where the term mutual aid is being co-opted. Like I was reminded the other day of during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, Oakland PD was talking about how they received mutual aid from other police departments. A police department doesn't receive mutual aid. They get more resources. That's all they get. It's not mutual aid. And so the theory itself for me is the ways in which we actually show up and practice this thing that we call mutual aid.
And I think beyond that, when we talk theory, before actually really tackling the question, is what are we doing? What are we building? What
Mhm,
are we reconstructing? How is it a form of resistance? How is it a step towards liberation? What role
mhm,
does it have within revolution and social
mhm,
change? And those kind of questions and those kind of sort of frameworks or the like, or
mhm,
like the very fact that, when we talk about mutual aid, we're talking about something that's always existed.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so this is why I think there isn't that same emphasis on theory like with Marxism.
mhm.
Um, and again, I don't think these things are actually mutually exclusive necessarily, because I think they are focusing in some ways on different aspects of human organization, of societies, of whatever.
Right.
But yeah, but there isn't, this person's critique of that person's critique of that person's critique of Marx,
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't have that history of theory in that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's why I didn't think there was a full episode on just talking about theory. And if there was, it would be too involved with practice
Yeah.
for it to be a separate episode.
Yeah.
So I think we'll probably do this episode contained theory and practice, and then do one more episode on history. And
Mhm,
within the history,
mhm,
we'll be talking about the term, like the history of the term with Kropotkin, but
mhm,
also the different conceptions of mutual aid. Many of the words we don't know because many of those societies have been erased or destroyed or pushed
mhm,
so far into the margins that we don't have access to, you know, through processes
mhm.
of colonialism, but also of capitalism and, industrialization and the like. So I think let's get into it.
Yeah, let's do
So
it.
What is mutual aid?
What is mutual aid?
What is mutual
Um,
aid?
yeah, right. How do you define that for yourself?
Um, I think of mutual aid as a way, creating networks of support and communities of care. I
Hmm.
think that's like the sort of basis of it. I
Hmm.
think it
Hmm.
is a method of survival, and I think it is what keeps us together as a society. I really like David Graeber's definitions of how we all practice like essentially anarchist principles every day,
Hmm.
every single day. And I'm not just talking about, the nice stuff that you do extra for your friends or family. Like the descriptions he uses is like if you're ever waiting for a bus and the people get off the bus and you just kind of naturally stand away so people can leave. And
Yeah.
there's not this competition of I'm getting on first. It's no, we all just have this mutual understanding and kind of quiet agreement that you get on, you're closer, just get in, and it's kind of just organized by itself.
Hmm.
And he gives a lot of like little examples like that. They feel so banal, but again, mutual aid, I won't get into that history, but as a term or a practice and as a theory, really comes about, especially in the West, set against the capitalist notion of competition.
Yeah.
And that, for
Yeah.
instance, competition was the driving force of evolution. And that
Yeah.
the only reason that people are here is because we're constantly fighting to be here. And again, that's just not the case. There is a
Yeah.
lot of competition, obviously, but for the most part, the way societies function is with this mutual understanding of just, it's, I don't know, just get on the bus. Like, I'm not going to get into a fight every single fucking day to get on the bus.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And it's more historical. Like, again, aside from the city, like how a countryside, like how like villages or towns, especially particularly in the non-Western world, um, the way those functions as economic and social units. So I think with Kropotkin talks about like the fucking 14th century, his history is not very good. Actually, I'm not going to talk about that. Yeah, that to me is mutual aid. So it's that thing that kind of already exists, and is the glue of human society in
Yeah.
part, but it is also a tool um, to to show up for each other, to protect one another, to support each other,
Yeah.
especially those that are, yeah, so heavily marginalized and peripheralized by the structures of domination we live under.
Yeah.
It is a tool that provides that support, but it's also it's a way of repoliticizing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, as in, yeah, not out of a sense of duty or morality, but as quite literally, there's the system of domination that is fucking us all up. Who is it fucking up the most? Well, I'm opposed to that system, and so I'm supporting that person.
Hmm.
Because if that person falls, or that identity, that community, and then the next one, then there's no one left for me to
Hmm.
support or to
Hmm.
stand up for me. So standing up for each other as a means of supporting the community, making it stronger, so we can all resist those systems together. Um,
Hmm.
and here, not like, this is why things like fascism tend to form and reproduce itself most vigorously at places like borders or with
Yeah.
houseless communities,
Yeah.
um, because they really have very few people defending them and they have no resources themselves, or very
Yeah.
few. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to stop it there because obviously I can go on, but I do want to try to give those concise things.
Yeah.
So, what about you?
Yeah. I'm similar. And for me, I define it as taking responsibility for our material conditions, not waiting for someone to take care of things for us, organizing, coming together as individuals in a way that is committed towards the collective, not putting the collective over the individual, and then figuring out together how do we resolve the issues, the material conditions, how do we move beyond the scarcity, the oppression, the domination that we live under. And so it really, like, part of mutual aid for me, I really do define it as a form of this resistance, because it's not just about giving and receiving help. It's about challenging the norms and the systems that have failed to meet our needs. And it's about this deep, deep commitment, like you said, of our communities unto each other. That if you go down, I'm going to go down. It might be later on, it might be immediately after, it might be at the same exact time. But what happens to you is going to happen to me. And so if I want to take care of myself, I need to take care of you. Um, and the understanding that like we live in this system that has essentially had us outsource our care work, have outsourced our autonomy, outsourced our sense of power, that we could do this and we could care for each other and we could, I don't need a state to make sure that I'm safe. In fact, safety under the state is under a certain paradigm, under certain criteria. And if I don't meet those criteria, I will never be safe. And for most of us, we will never meet those criteria, whether it's our racialized bodies, our genderized bodies, our class. We're not going to meet those criteria the way the system wants us to meet them. And so we could suffer, or we could figure out how to come together and take our power back and organize and build the alternatives. And it's the we keep saying like we take care of us, we take care of us, right? This is the practice of what it means to take care of us. And the practice of liberation and the practice of instead of top down, I do this for you because I have something and I could give it to you to make myself feel better. It's this horizontal, like, no, we're connected, we're intertwined, and we're going to do this together. And we're going to move through this together. Yeah, those are the main points for me. Is this is a intricate practice of solidarity, an intimate practice of solidarity and connection, and reclaiming my power and my autonomy, and deciding that I'm not going to wait for some savior, whether it's a state or it's a person, to elevate myself out of the situation I'm in. I'm going to figure it out with my community together, and we're going to do it together with what we have, and we're going to grow together.
Yeah. And so how that manifests as organizations or as groups or as collectives, um, there is something about applying that very notion, those principles and those values into just the forms that we're organizing amongst ourselves. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think mutual aid, almost always, if done properly and like intentfully, um, is a internal and external practice.
Yeah.
And so in the group I'm a part of, that's definitely been something that we're very conscious of, which is oftentimes the mutual aid is us together, the 10 of
Mm-hmm.
us in this like organizing group.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I think what something that I've always avoided doing, because I never like oppositional thinking, and I think it's so important, especially at this point, to be able to come up with definitions of mutual aid on its own terms.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I've always hit up several problems, one of which is a lack of coherence of the very tangible forms, and the fact that, when I describe that it's something that has always existed and that exists in so many different forms, like you can't pinpoint like that is mutual aid, um,
Yeah.
or rather that that's when it started or that's whatever, that
Yeah.
it always changes and has different forms based on different locales and different contexts and different cultures. And so it's that kind of like it's everything and therefore it's nothing. So
Mm.
that's why I find myself doing a thing I don't like doing, and I hope eventually we will no longer have to do it, which is,
I mean, this is the part of the process of defining what mutual aid, right?
yeah,
This podcast is for us trying to get really clear on this.
no, exactly, because I want, again, and this is why I'm surprised it doesn't exist. Like, wait, the conversation
Yeah.
hasn't gone further,
Yeah.
because yes, I still feel the need to do this thing wherein defining mutual aid in opposition to charity,
Yeah.
because I think people understand or have a feeling of understanding charity
Yeah.
and how charity works, um, and as structures.
Mm.
People know charities, they've given money to charities, they know about their structures, and there are some very famous ones in like the Bill Gates Foundation or whatever, or the
Mm-hmm.
Bill and Linda or whatever. Um, and so yeah, it is, I think, a bit helpful because we've seen, especially in the last 40 years, charity is becoming these massive things that are just, ways for people to launder their money, and
Mm-hmm.
they give a lot of money supposedly, but nothing's really changing. If anything, things
Mm-hmm.
are still getting worse.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just this facade of it all. Charity is still within the white saviorist model, whereas instead of it being tanks to come and, fix your society, it's this guy with a bunch of money and I'm going to plant whatever. But I will
Mm-hmm.
not say anything about the tanks that the economy that I am a part of, that I help, whatever, that I am a big part of, is destroying and creating the
Yeah.
reasons for your poverty in large
Yeah.
parts. And so there's a kind of contradiction or hypocrisy. It's not even a contradiction, it's just bullshit. Because
Yeah.
again, they benefit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think going back to what you started with, like this is even in our research, right? Like when you read about this stuff, when you try to understand and define mutual aid, you actually end up a lot of times, like from my research, is like there's more time spent trying to show how it's not charity and the differences between charity and mutual aid, um, than actually concretely saying this is what mutual aid looks like. And part of it, as you said, is because of the fact that mutual aid looks so different in so many different places. And depending on the culture and the place, they're not going to call it mutual aid. It's actually now just becoming this like more global term. But like when I remember talking to, I interviewed my father a couple of years ago because during COVID, he engaged in mutual aid, but he wouldn't call it like that. What he says, he's like, oh yeah, I saw my community. He was in Egypt at the time. And he defined it as like, I looked around and I saw, and people needed oxygen, and there was no oxygen. So I figured out how to get oxygen. And then slowly people started to like help me get oxygen tanks and help me like fund them and help me do this. And like this network popped up of like borrowing and moving oxygen tanks around for people who needed it, right? He wouldn't call that mutual aid, and he still doesn't call that mutual aid. He's just, I'm doing what I need to do. That this was a need, and uh, I was, I was fulfilling my duties, my religious duties, my community duties, my like my duties as a person to this place, right? And when you expand the definition a little bit and you start looking at like the actions, this is why we go back to like we couldn't figure out how to do this, like to talk about theory without the practice, because when you start talking about the practice, then the conversation becomes a lot more, people could engage more deeper with it and they could come up with examples of
Mm,
how they engage in this stuff.
yeah,
But when you're so focused on the theory, when you talk about Copernican and his animals and why he did like, and it's vital
yeah.
work. And it really, especially at a time where Darwin's work was being weaponized against those who didn't have power, those the oppressed class, it was really important work. But that's not, it's also really hard to kind of think about humans like the same way as birds migrate and support each other, right? Like our social structures and our relations look very different and engage very differently than the migratory birds or all the animals that engage and all the species that engage in mutual aid. Um, and I also think that we are really at a time because charity is so pervasive. It's everywhere and it makes everyone like it's a way for people to say, but I did my part, right? In the US, right, it's a very big thing where it's like, oh, is it tax deductible? Because the charity is usually tax deductible. But they don't realize like, hey, your $10 is not gonna do anything for your taxes. Like you're not even in the bracket where that's gonna do anything for you. But it's become such a pervasive language and pervasive practice of like, but I did something, so I
Mm,
don't have to feel bad. Um, and so like we do need to spend some time in some ways to kind of being like, okay, what is it not? So that we know how do we like kind of take off the brown leaves of the plant, right? Um, clear
oh,
up some
lovely.
foliage, you know?
Yeah, I like that metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I sort of dunked a bit too hard on myself to begin with in terms of like, yeah, yeah, about having to do the comparison of what it's not.
Yeah.
But, I mean, for reasons. But yeah, so that is a good place to start with. Like, I think it's the recognition that there are many structures that exist
Mm,
that make it seem like there's things happening. That, oh, it's fine because we can give some money and it'll be okay.
right,
But when the problems are political, when
right.
the problems are structural, when we're talking about things like imperialism, like there is no amount of NGO funding that will end Zionism. Like this
Yeah,
is a very intensely political, military, whatever, colonial issue.
yeah.
And that the solutions will be political, any real solutions.
Hmm.
Um, but so I think, yeah, dispelling that notion is important. That it's not just people have a, I did a good thing, I did my quota, I shouldn't feel
Hmm.
bad, but that
Hmm.
there are things that exist. We don't need to build new things or replace or develop alternatives. Like there is already a structure in place, and it's called the charity. And there are starving children, and so we put a bit of money there, and then
Hmm.
I mean, we never really look back again. And this is why I
Yeah,
think there's something
yeah.
so cynical about how that charity logic. I think one of the most evil things in human history is behavioral economics.
Mm.
Like the
Hmm.
entire study of using psychoanalysis to
Oh my God.
determine how to make people more whatever, because
Yeah.
you end up with things like, yeah, when you buy something and it's like 10% of this is going to go to whatever.
Mm.
So through the consumption, through participating in capitalism and consumerism, you feel like you're doing your quota because you
Hmm.
bought, and it's huge in Europe. It's
Hmm.
huge. Just all
Hmm.
you have to do is put something and have it on green font.
Hmm. I just bought like the Pally Coke the other day.
Yeah.
It's so proud of itself and like I mean, great. I'm really actually happy that there's alternatives to fucking Coke, right? Um, but their whole marketing scheme is liberation through cola,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right?
It's
It's
bizarre.
like
And it's again, it's a lot of vague. It's for like peace and whatever, but not.
right.
I mean, end
Are we looking
Zionism,
at the
like, because that's
structure? Yeah,
risky. Yeah, that's
right.
intense, but that's a real thing.
Right.
Anyway, so or then yeah, of like sad girl, whatever. I've been very critical of these as well, and some of them like Mecca Cola and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. I
um,
do also want to name when it comes to charity. At this point in our society, we've erased the origins, right, of what charity
mm,
was. And it was originally a way for the ruling class and especially a specific rich, right, who buy their way to heaven, right?
oh
Give to
yeah,
the poor to get to heaven. This is it's a Christian Protestant based way of thinking of like first off, I have this money because God bestowed it on me and I'm better off. And so I'm gonna give you some so that I could secure my place in heaven. And I go back also to make them feel better, but I did my part. I gave this and blah blah blah. Yes, I exploited people and I killed how many people and my practices have ravaged the earth and life.
mm,
But it's okay because I gave a few $1 million to the orphanage and now the children could have some meals for the next couple of years, right? um, a fraction of what the damage that you've actually done.
yeah.
And then there's the strings attached, right? Like there's the you could only get this if you're this and that. And if you don't fit, then you don't get it and it's your fault, there's something wrong with you. uh,
And I mean, to be honest, the way people treat private property and capitalism as
mhm.
a whole is religious. There's really not
Yeah.
much of a logic or rationale
Oh
at
yeah.
this point. It is just no, he earned it. It's his. Why
Yeah.
why is it his? Because it belongs to him. It's like to who determined that? And there's a
Yeah.
thing that a lot of people never name, which is the state.
Mm.
And so I think I do want to talk a bit about, I mean, because that's a very like obviously like Western European model of
Yeah.
charity within religion, but
Yep.
there is an older Christian tradition and obviously the Muslim tradition, of
Yep.
zakat.
Yep. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and like
I mean,
also the sort of forbidding of interest and the
yeah.
like.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up zakah because zakah is actually a really great example of practice because within zakah, you're supposed to be giving to the person directly. You look them in the eye, you go meet your neighbor, the one who you know needs help, and you give it to them because they actually have that right over you, that you have more than them and they're suffering, and they have the right over you to actually be receiving that. And in today's world, you see all these Muslim nonprofits
Yeah.
who take your zakah and they do what they do with it, with their really high salaried executives and their marketing plans and all this other stuff. And so we've actually stripped away the relationship building that is core to what's it, and it's designed to allow you to connect at a human level and like understand that like you're one, you know? Um,
Yeah, and that's such an important thing that is embedded within mutual aid in theory, which
mm-hmm,
is
mm-hmm,
when you are giving, let's say, money to someone, it is not, I am so good, I'm just a nice guy. I just like,
mm,
there is a recognition, oftentimes, again, this isn't the case everywhere, where it's like, it's in our very class-based societies, I have this money because you don't.
mm,
That like there is no situation of power that does not have a disempowered.
yeah.
And so there is this political recognition of that difference. I mean, again, it's not a one-to-one. And so this is something we brought up last time, which is trying to redistribute
Mm,
as like not just within us, but sort of steal from the wealthy. This is why
mm-hmm,
there's one like mutual aid practice that I found very cool that I learned about in France where like people would I don't know, steal food
mm,
from places like Carrefour. Again, so here's the thing again. So I think a lot of times when people talk about mutual aid, they talk around anarchism,
yeah,
because anarchism is another one of those things. And if we can talk about theory, we're
yeah,
talking about anarchism.
yeah, yeah.
The idea that it is not capital, it is not money or any identity that is central, it is power.
Mm,
That all around us, all these things are implements of power, tools of power, structures of power. And so anarchists, and again, there's no one type of anarchist. This is very broad. Again, I think this is something that's always existed as opposed to something that's like newly formed, just like the 18th, 19th century European philosophizing around this or activism. They had some pretty cool shit at the time.
mm-hmm.
Activism, I mean, quite cool shit. It's hard to define as activism. But anyway, which is an opposition to all forms of power,
Mm,
or at least a very heavy suspicion that the
yeah,
benefit of the doubt or whatever. And so this sort of thing of illegitimate power and
mm,
authority.
yeah.
And so
Consolidating of power.
this
Mm-hmm,
is why there's a constant suspicion, but also
mm-hmm,
in our own practice of not replicating any of those power structures, of not using any position that we gain by, let's say, being the one giving the money, by
mm,
being the one making certain decisions, to
mm,
then be enacting a certain type of power, which again, our problem with capitalism, many,
yeah,
but it's
yeah,
it's how it creates and cements structures of power and domination.
yeah.
Specifically, although again more complicated, of the bourgeoisie against the working class and
Right,
the poor.
right.
And
Yeah,
so mutual aid as a practice,
yeah.
as a form that's like more intentful, aside from the thing that's always existed, is to kind of a reclaim that kind of autonomy.
Mm-hmm,
Also, this is part of the theory, I guess, which is that like, okay, there always have been issues of power, issues of whatever, but this form of domination is new.
mm-hmm,
That I do believe in this kind of, I don't know if this is Rousseau or whatever, but that like organic societies,
yeah,
even like we're talking whatever, I mean, back to the pharaohs, what's called civilization and the like, um, but pre-patriarchy, pre-capitalism, pre-whatever,
yeah.
not utopic, but I think this is, yeah, was like one in which there was not this sort of codified systems of domination.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that because I was actually just learning about these the water systems in Persia, ancient Persia, called the Qanats, and how they essentially helped distribute power, even though they were technically owned by one person. That person had responsibility to the community, and the social relations and the way the power was distributed was through the power through access to water, and who got what and how they got it, and making sure that everyone got access was critical to the social fabric. And in modern day Iran and in modern day globalization, industrialization, that system has been stripped away to the point of now, at a time where, I mean, Iran is a very arid environment, right? Under these water systems that centered mutual care and mutual and social relations, gardens flourished in deserts,
Mm.
right? Like they were able to sustain a civilization for how many thousands of years? Persia has been there for how many years? I like through all the different iterations of what it is. And it's not till the system has been stripped away and to the modern day water distribution systems controlled by the state, um, that one, now you have water crisis. You don't have the same access to water that you had before. And it's just changed the entire infrastructure, both land and the actual availability of water, but also the social fabric, right? And so, and that took the rupture of the relations, the social relations, the mutual commitment to each other, even though it's still one person owned that property, and but they had a responsibility to everyone else.
Mm.
So it's not necessarily private property, but the fact that like this exploitation, and the way capitalism engages with private property, and the rupture of social relations, and the idea that we need to take care of each other. Um, and so like it's that is an interesting example, because like when you look at it from like um, a theoretical mutual aid like perspective, might not look like mutual aid at the beginning, but then when you dig into it and you see how that system actually sustained life, sustained care, and it was done through social relations and through commitment and through a we're in this together mentality, then yeah, you kind of redefine and like reshifts what mutual aid could look like and how this could evolve and be, you know? And I what you're saying, right, in that the way capitalism exists right now, it's organized, it's consolidating power, it's organized, like it's basically moving in a way to strip most of us away from our autonomy and our power and our abilities. And I have like here, as I was reflecting before we sat down and jotting some down notes, is like, yeah, the rich and the ruling class work to organize human labor, and they work to organize human labor in a way that is to their benefit. And essentially that means that we're being exploited. Those of us not in power, those with us no, without not at the top of the pyramid, are being stripped away from autonomy. We're being exploited for the benefit of the few on top, right? So my question becomes like, what is it? Why are we not organizing our own labor so that we could sustain our own power and grow our own power?
Yeah.
And so like, and that to me
And
is mutual
so
aid.
that's a part of mutual aid. And then within that movement building, mutual aid is really important because
Yeah.
how do we harness, or how do people, and historically, and even to this very moment, how do workers organize? And like, what is the power that they have over their bosses and their
Mm-hmm.
employers? Is the fact that, they are so disempowered that all they can do is then they have no access to land, to resources, to means of production. And so they can only rent themselves and rent their
Mm-hmm.
time and rent their
Mm-hmm.
labor. And
Mm-hmm.
so if they stop working, then
Right.
the bosses lose money. And if they only care about profit, again, this is a bit detached because I think we found genuinely, especially as like wealth has become so detached from just like
Yeah.
fucking material, whatever. I don't know, all this
Yeah.
um, stock market bullshit, these
Yeah. The
bubbles.
virtual. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so in theory, this is where the strikes come from. This is where the idea of, okay, if we put together, if we all stop at the same time and we all agree and we're cohesive, then they'll give in to our demands. And
Right.
oftentimes that's quite limited, I think. And I think one of the most incredible films I've ever watched is Salt of the Earth
Mm.
from 1954 about miner strikes in the South in the US
Oh
of like
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Latin, like it just shows this like cross race class based movement that
Yeah.
then also again it's incredible because the women get involved.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
women, the wives, the ones who are sidelined and they're like, no, I don't get it. why are you protesting against your boss and then you come back home and you're my boss? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to go and participate in the strike with you. And the film is quite whatever euphoric because it's sort of this joint cross-class, cross-gender, class-based assault. And I think
Yeah.
they win. Spoiler. I'm not sure if they win actually. I think it might be a bit more sad. But anyway, but
Yeah.
so again, because there are power relations within the household that are also economic in nature and there's exploitation there. But essentially, what breaks it becomes like a kind of war of attrition. And usually the workers cannot hold out as much as the bosses because the bosses, it's just like, oh, I'm losing profit. But
Mm.
for workers, it's I'm losing my livelihood.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is the fact that they have to be able to sustain that strike.
Yeah.
And how do they
Yeah.
sustain that strike? But through mutual aid. And
Yeah.
again, oftentimes it's not described as such, but these
Yeah.
are strike funds. These are funds that are collected together to be able to sustain people as they strike to
Yeah.
avoid scabbing,
Yeah.
but also to avoid starvation
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
as they resist. And so I think that's a very concrete example of mutual aid within a bigger struggle that
Yeah.
it's a necessary component of,
Yeah.
and a very intentful political one. And I think there are other examples like it. And one of the
Yeah.
best conversations that are happening within the People's Want, this internationalist group that I highly recommend everybody check out, they talk a lot about mutual aid, is how to build something similar at a kind of international scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously, there are a lot of complications, but it's this idea that if we're to recognize that we're all in this together and that we need each other. And so, what are those like physical, what are the material needs? And especially with societies and with people that are so deprived of the basics,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a
Mm-hmm.
group in Lebanon called Buzurna Juzurno. They're incredible. They're part of the People's Wants. And they focus on collective agriculture, on sustainable agriculture. Because I'll give you a very interesting example that one of them told me, which is after the invasion of Iraq by the Americans in 2003,
Mm-hmm.
um, with the new government and with the new constitution that basically like mandated the liberalization of the economy so that they can allow in more foreign goods. So American companies, not just oil, but all this other shit, telecommunications and the like, can basically just go and do their shit without any protection.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, one thing they started doing is selling seeds to farmers. And again, some of this was like mandated, like there's not other options, and it's much cheaper and it's whatever. And the
Yeah.
problem is these seeds bear fruit and vegetables that do not bear other seeds. They're
Yeah.
genetically modified such that you have to keep buying those seeds from that company.
Yeah.
And therein is, like you said, the autonomy is removed. The ability to then, and this is structural to charity, because there's not this charity that helps build a community that can be self-sufficient and autonomous. Because again, a lot of the reasons they're not is not because they don't have access to money, but because
Yeah.
of political reasons. That
Yeah.
even if you go and you build a school, it'll be destroyed. Or even if
Mm-hmm.
you go and give a sandwich or give a meal, well, the structural, um, I mean, famines that we see, these are
Yeah.
political in the Sudan, in Gaza. Um, and so without even having an acknowledgement of those political things, then you can't take action in whatever shape and form that has. That calls for, crossings to be opened.
Yeah.
And that's not to say, and so that's why it's like two sides of a very similar coin. Um, and that charities only focus on the one intentfully.
Yeah.
Sometimes they pretend it's quite, or yeah, when they insist this is not political work, this is humanitarian.
Yeah.
But that's ignorance. That is just wrong. Like that's not my analysis or that's not my tendency or as an anarchist. Like no, you cannot be for a people or claim to
Yeah.
support them if you're only fulfilling half of their needs or
Yeah.
listening to them half as much.
Right. Yeah. What you're doing is stabilizing the system of oppression that's dominating and keeping them down. You're not actually, you're not shifting anything. You're stabilizing the destruction, the exploitation, and the death. Um, yeah. And I mean, this is why you see like charities, all these big organizations, when there's conflict, they're the first to pull out.
Yeah.
And they're not willing to take the risk. They're not willing to stand up and say, no, what you're doing is wrong because, oh, well, we can't risk our funding. We can't do this and blah, blah, blah. And we don't get involved in this. And we need to protect our relationship so we have access in the future. There's no one left. There's no future anyways.
Mm.
Like, um, yeah. And it is this stripping away of the reality. And I mean, choosing to not be political is you choosing to be political. You're just not claiming it.
Yeah.
You've shown where you are and where you stand. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I mean, I think this is a quote by Howard Zinn, you cannot be neutral on a moving train.
Hmm.
Um, but very much so, it just creates that sort of hypocrisy,
Right.
wherein if you are to be standing with a certain group or a community. And so, anyway, this is why all the things we've been talking about are kind of critiques of the charity model, which is very removed, which replicates the same hierarchies, which
Hmm.
does not even claim to be addressing the root issues. I really like, for instance, the term radical, because I
Mm.
think radical, same with anarchism, gets a bad rap, and
Oh yeah.
obviously very intentionally like smeared,
Hmm.
not just by the right, but also by like authoritarian tendencies on the left,
Hmm. Hmm.
for different reasons. But essentially, radical sounds, I don't know, guns ablazing, going out, just like stupid, not really political, just go and break it. No, no. So like the term radical means at the root.
Yeah.
If you remember from math, the radical, like
Hmm.
a square root,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah. Yeah.
but so quite literally it is just that it's trying to get to the root of the problem. Um, and oftentimes we find once you just go a few steps further, why is there this need anyway? Why is there the lack of resources? Why do people have to go and buy it as opposed to why is there not just access or whatever? Um, Oftentimes it's capitalism. Oftentimes it's patriarchy. Oftentimes it's
Right.
imperialism. Like
Yeah.
it hits onto these things um, that again
Yeah.
have to do with structures of power. And again, I
Hmm.
want to emphasize this. When I talk about power, it necessitates a disempowering. So no one gets wealthy without someone being whatever. We
Yeah.
all live essentially in a closed system on this earth.
Yeah. There's ways. I mean, we are in the like boundaries in this world are. I mean, they've always been. They're not legit. They're not real. These borders and all this stuff. And now with all the technology and everything, like we're in each other's world, and our differences and our experiences, even though they seem so very different, right? What's happening in Gaza seems like thousands of miles away and has nothing to do with me, but it actually is because the system that's doing that is the same system and they're learning from that and they're bringing it back to wherever we are, right? um and so like how do we, those of us who are resisting, then learn to move beyond these time and space and be able to show up for each other and connect with each other even when we're not fully seeing the connection yet? And beyond just, yes, funding is really important, but what else? Like I think about like knowledge sharing and resource sharing and skill sharing, the free clinics that show up in communities to support like our houseless people, the community kitchens that, community kitchens in Gaza are being targeted the same way community kitchens in the US are being targeted. In LA, Food Not Bombs gets arrested and stopped by the police all the time to the
Mm,
point where they can't function anymore. In Gaza, they get bombed. It's the same system that's doing the same thing.
yeah.
And the problem is that we're showing up to feed each other and take care of each other, of a group of people that the system has deemed not wanted and unreplaceable, right? Um, and so mutual aid becomes this like statement of, no, you don't get to do that. You
Mm.
don't get to just decide that a group of people is not worth it and we're going to just throw them away. We're going to do what we need to do to make sure that they're protected. And we're going to learn from them in the process,
That's
because the
yeah.
truth is, they're even if we're in a situation like Gaza, it's something that's really, really present with me. It's like there's the power disparity, there's the resource disparity. There, those of us outside who are supporting mutual aid projects in Lebanon and Gaza, the primary thing is, okay, let's get money to them, let's get resources to them. But what are we like? How are we learning from what they're
Right.
going through and what they're experiencing? Because it's still a two-way street, right?
Mm.
And we need to be like keeping our eyes open, because how they're surviving really is going to help us develop our tools, our tactics, our strategies as we face our own systems, you know?
Yeah. Our own system's collapsing
Yeah,
100%.
yeah,
Um, and I think one thing that people always ask is like, where's the mutuality in it, especially in these in
yeah,
these networks where it's like
yeah.
we're organizers and there's whatever. I think it's very obvious in some of the language we use. There's like a constant intentionality to avoid this thing of like, but also there is two ways. There is aid that goes both ways. But
Hmm.
again, sorry,
Yeah,
I don't want to say it like that because I feel like I'm trying to conform to a very charity
yeah,
uh,
I know.
model of to where's the transaction.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
if it's mutual, then where's the whatever? But it's I think there's a oh, actually, in the Internationalist Manifesto by the People's Want, they bring up the labor um, strike mutual aid like funds,
Hmm.
and they said something very interesting, which is that they would declare that this is not a donation but a loan,
Mm.
for that when, my time comes, that you will be by
Yeah.
my side. And so I think
Mm.
there's that.
I like that. I've been using, I in my work with Reza, I've been using gift,
Mm,
because I wanted to move away from donation, but even gift feels like it's not the right language.
yeah,
Um, because yeah, like, and that's part of it, is that our language has been stripped. Our language has been watered down. And so we're in this process of not only trying to figure out new ways of relating to each other, but how do we articulate our experiences with each other and create new language to actually capture what we're trying to do. And I'm hoping that as we continue this project, that language for us becomes more clarified and we could better articulate. So like I imagine a year from now, what does this episode could look like? Can we come back and like redefine mutual aid from our learnings from a year, and
yeah.
what language has changed and what has emerged?
So, I mean, because like I do, for instance, like the concept of duty.
Mm,
I know how it's been very co-opted and it's very shitty,
yeah.
but to me,
Yeah.
that's how I perceive it, as in,
I'm the same way. I have a duty to life. Yeah.
yeah, 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 and but also given like my relative privilege, and the access of resources that I have and how easily I can mobilize them, and even the very fact of me being very fluent in English or being
Yeah.
a good writer, like I can
Yeah.
apply for a grant and get a
Yeah.
person money that they can't even find the grant because it's not,
Yeah.
in pamphlets in front of their face and then the writing of the whatever. But anyway, yeah, I think actually then you hit on something very important, which is the relationships that are built. Because
Mm,
I think when we talk about mutual aid, it is really important to note that mutual aid is sometimes also a setting,
mm,
um, in which we can meet one another.
yeah.
And so you brought up foods not bombs, and I kind of remember that like 30 minutes ago I started talking about stealing food from supermarkets, and then I went off on one. But I remember, so it's foods not bombs is a good example of this, of like sometimes stealing food, sometimes dumpster diving,
Yeah.
cooking that shit up and serving it for
Yeah.
free to
Yeah.
people. Um, and sometimes it's just run by, I don't know, some of the same people. And this is a massive distinction with charity of like, here is some food for today, as opposed to here is a structure by which you can continuously feed yourself and your community.
Right. Right.
Hello, it's if you imagine in a different situation where there could be like a collective farming
Yeah.
on land that they don't have to pay rent for or whatever, then that
Right.
I think might soothe more bourgeois sensibilities. But this is fine. This is cool, especially when you're stealing from like something like Carrefour, which there's already like a massive boycott on
Yeah.
for Palestine.
Yeah.
Um, and so bringing people together there, talking, getting more people involved, increasing the scope of your conversations and your understanding of the world around you. Again, I keep talking about this with my experience with queer mutual aid, is that my understanding of Lebanon has drastically changed
Yeah.
from the conversations that I've had with just ordinary people um, that like Syrian refugee queer folk, like their experience of being in Lebanon. I can't just say, yeah, but it's just because they're Syrian. You know what I mean? It's not them, it's the system. But it's
Yeah.
parts of the system I don't see
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
because I'm Lebanese. And so
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really have a good sense of how, even just being Lebanese in Lebanon, again, war situation aside, wherein it's a fucking hellscape for everybody and fuck Israel, um, sorry, is a form of privilege vis-a-vis
Yeah.
the Syrian.
Yeah.
Um, being passing or whatever as a Lebanese, but the like. And so part of the frustration with NGOs and with charities is that it is transactional. Um, is that it is not embedded work that creates these long-term whatever
Yeah.
communities and networks and relationships.
Yeah.
And if there is, it is one way. But yeah, it's the learning from each other.
Yeah.
It's the building together. It's the sort of actually talking to one another and not just talking about, again, in our network, the amount of times we're in conversation with someone and they're like, we need this, we need that. And we're like, I'm here for you. We'll talk. We'll see how we can help. But I just need you to know we are not an NGO. They're like, what? Like, we're just a group of people. What do you mean? It's like, none of us are getting paid. We formed this 4 years ago because the community's fucked and we're part of the community and we're like, we need to help each other. And
Mm-hmm.
their tone changes completely,
Mm-hmm.
completely. And
Mm-hmm.
we're able to have conversations and they're just sometimes talking and not expecting anything, but it's just, I mean, that honestly, that's part of it in terms of like the loneliness and the frustrations.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's just, you actually form sort of relationships that way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and we have found in a lot of cases that then people want to engage with similar work,
Mm-hmm.
offer their services. Someone has a car, or someone has access to this, someone has this medicine, someone knows, um, I don't know, like this person or whatever. And
Yeah.
I mean, I will also say that these networks kind of always existed amongst queer communities in Lebanon. Um, like there are informal networks of care.
Yeah.
Uh,
There always has to be when a
yeah,
community is oppressed and marginalized. Yeah.
yeah. I When I remember doing research about mutual aid, the like earliest examples that I could find of things like explicitly defined as mutual aid, I think were like black workers in the US and the North,
Mm.
what are described, I don't know if this is a problematic term, as like freed,
Mm.
like non-enslaved, um, funeral funds,
Yeah. Yeah.
because like
Yeah.
there was no funding for burying,
Yeah.
because
I
even
mean, the
though,
Underground Railroad is a mutual aid
oh,
project.
yeah,
Like we don't ever talk about that within that context, but that whole system
yeah.
is a mutual aid project, you know?
Let's save that for the history episode
Yeah, that's a
though.
whole
Yeah.
it's a whole episode on itself. Yeah. No, and
Because
it's
the
true.
yeah. Okay, go on.
Yeah. No, no, I said like in communities within the US, like the those who had been enslaved and like had to find ways to survive. And their survival was based on their community's mutual aid, how they supported each other away from those who were enslaving them, and finding ways to cultivate resources and sharing what little bit they have, right? Whether it's the small gardens that they grew some extra food, or sharing what they have, or looking out for each other. Those are all the practices that we don't engage in and we don't talk about, but that is mutual aid. Those are communities coming together to meet each other's need when the system is literally designed to sever you and isolate you and kill you.
Yeah. I mean, that's a obviously very extreme example.
Yeah.
Um, I look at a bit, oh, sorry, I don't want to get into the history because I do want to save that for that episode. But when I think of
Yeah.
like cooking practices,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the thing is, a lot of these practices are raised,
Yeah.
um, and a lot of them are what's called like feminized labor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
As we're talking, what I'm realizing, like something that's emerging for me is um, when you think about relationships and mutual aid versus charity, right? Charity and charity organizations, they're in relationship with their donors, with
yeah,
those on top. That's who they're in relationship with.
yeah,
Mutual aid, we're in relationship with each other. We're
yeah.
in community with each other and we're in relationship with each other. And I think that's fundamentally a major, major difference in because it changes everything in how we approach and view and enact the practices, you know?
And like when you say each other, that is exactly the process, even just like linguistically of forming community.
Right, right.
Like it's not me helping X and Y. There's a
No.
kind of like obviously you don't have to have this identification. Sometimes it's problematic to be like I'm with them, but I think to a certain extent, no, actually, I mean, I there is with that a lot of disavowal.
Mm,
Not to say that you can cease to be white by
mm-hmm,
working with marginalized and like racialized communities,
mm-hmm.
but that you situate that whiteness,
Right,
and you constantly check it essentially,
right, right.
but also let go of this sort of like epistemological violence. Sorry, two
Yeah.
episodes in a row I've used that term, and I've refrained from using it for like a year because it's very terminological or it's very like fancy. But even in how you understand yourself,
Yeah. Yeah.
and here we have to break out of individualism a bit,
Yeah.
and understand yourself as a product of so many of these structures that still exist, very much so, like very intensely, white supremacy and patriarchy. And so then, like understanding, I don't know, yourself, your
Mm-hmm,
masculinity, your person
mm-hmm,
as a middle class, whatever,
mm-hmm,
um, not
mm-hmm,
aspirational to those above you, quote unquote, but those below you, quote unquote.
mm-hmm.
Um, and again, if you want to be participating in movements of liberation and whatever, like these are people to talk to. Like these are the people that need to be centered. These are the people who for whom no revolution means anything unless it's addressing those needs. Like these are the people being most victimized by these systems. And so in the Lebanese uprising or in the revolution in Lebanon rather, um, yeah, things that were completely ignoring the poor, um,
Yeah.
the nationalism of it all,
Yeah.
the the all these things that started to really come out as things went on, and then the sectarianization of it all, and whatever, started to make to lose that kind of revolutionary impetus, which to me has to be kind of internationalist and intersectional for it to mean
Mm-hmm,
anything.
mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
Sorry, again, that goes quite into theory. I mean, that's within the remit of this episode.
It is totally within this episode.
It's fine. We're doing this so that we don't have to later on and we don't get too lost. Obviously, we will keep coming into these same issues because we've been thinking a lot about them.
Mm-hmm.
But it's this very expansive intellectual work of connecting these very basic things we do and we see and that we are creating, these very like
Yeah.
sometimes seemingly small, because again, like mutual aid can never function at the state level. Part of the problem of the state is that it is too big to exist without immense amounts of violence.
Yeah.
Um, and so we are always talking about quite local, regional, um, even cities are oftentimes way too big.
Right.
But you have pockets and you have these networks that are communities.
Right.
And so,
But
again,
that's
that's,
the thing. Yeah,
yeah,
even within that, like I'm thinking as you practice mutual aid, right? You have these pockets, you have these little things, but as you do that, you're actually building space for alternate like the horizontal networks of societies. Like the example that's coming up for me right now, which we'll definitely do a whole episode just on this, is the first intifada and the mutual aid that was put in place to sustain that movement. And little pockets, right? Education, healthcare, grocery deliveries. Each village was separated under siege, but each of these little pockets created a meshed network that worked to sustain the movement that was there and to keep everyone connected to each other and supported, right? So yes, it's local, it's smaller than the state, and it's not this like each little thing in itself is not this gigantic thing, but it's part of an embedded mesh of network that is creates something that's much more expansive and much more powerful than any state could really be, in my
Mm.
opinion.
And I
And
think ultimately is opposed to the
yeah,
state,
is exactly. It
because
is
the
literally building the alternative.
yeah,
Yeah,
because the state is just an incredibly violent,
right,
like the formation of
right,
states, but then the
right,
maintenance of it.
right. And
Um,
and you know the power of that when in the example of the Intifada, right, is because coming out of that, the Oslo Accords destroyed the civil society that sustained the Intifada,
yeah,
right? And so like that shows you just how powerful that is. One, it got them to the table, the Zionists entered to the table to have a conversation. And two, part of that conversation was stripping away that network that sustained the
yeah,
people, right? And so there is power there, and at the level the state recognizes the power that is mutual aid. And so how do we make sure we protect it and keep like nurturing it, you know?
yeah. It's a really fucking powerful example, actually. I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Me too.
I would love to get a very good guest on to talk about it,
Yeah, me
but we'll
too.
also probably do some research.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, you mentioned earlier about like rooftop gardens or like balcony
Mm-hmm.
gardens, and that's something that
Mm-hmm.
was practiced.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
because in a lot of cases people were forbidden from cultivating their land,
Yeah.
or had their lands destroyed, or were only allowed certain sectors and hectares and whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I was
Um,
watching a documentary the other day, on the it was a short little doc. It's what was it called? I'll have to find the name and maybe we could post it up. Um, in the West Bank talking about the control of the water. And even the fact that when the water comes on, neighbors calling each other and like, hey, the water's here, fill up your tanks. That's mutual aid, right?
mm,
Like make sure everyone in the community knows that the water's here so that they could get what they need. That's and in that moment, we're not thinking about like mutual aid is this and this is what we call mutual aid, but it's the practice how we're showing up. It's the fact that innately as I got access to resources, my initial thought was not to hoard, it was to reach out to the rest of my community and tell them, "Hey, look, we got something. Let's get what we need." You know, which is very different than like in the US, all these storms that keep popping up. The first thing that people do is go to the grocery stores and hoard as much as they
yeah,
can. The shelves that are empty, the things that are like just and things spoil because no one needs that much food. Like we're
yeah,
not like, so it's the thought like that's what mutually does is it centers the collective, it centers the all over the individual.
yeah,
And that is a fundamental shift in how we exist in the current capitalistic, individualistic society. And that in itself is a danger to the system.
yeah. And is definitely something though that in protecting itself, the system co-opts.
Yeah.
And so I'll give a very concrete example in Lebanon, which is again, you brought up like a police department using mutual aid, which
Yeah. Oh my
again,
God.
I think that that'll be maybe an interesting conversation. Like, is
Mm-hmm.
that not mutual aid? It's like a using the tool of it, but then using it as tool for domination or whatever,
Yeah.
but it's resource sharing. It's separate from
Yeah.
anarchism and whatever,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
it's
either way.
true. It really the dark side of mutual aid.
Well, so like sectarian parties, I mean, okay, there's a very interesting example. I lived in a building in Beirut, and it was a very old building, and I was like, I think the only person that had moved into an apartment. I don't know who was living there before, but clearly no one else. Everyone had lived there for at least a decade or two,
Mm.
and all Lebanese families. And they really took care of each other. They were kind of like their doors were
Mm,
always open, literally in the summer. And when they would, during the Ramadan, the people on my floor, which is one in front of me, one to the left,
mm.
quite literally would cook in each other's places during the Ramadan. There would be a
That's
couple
really
of
cute.
stoves here and stoves here. It's really cute, but
I love it. I
no,
love
no, it's
that.
adorable. And especially these people in front of me were quite old, and they had a son
Yeah,
who had something, but he
yeah,
couldn't
more
like
of
climb
that.
up the stairs, and so I saw these neighbors climb like holding him like up the
Mm,
stairs. He's an older person, but I think it might have been elephantitis. I actually never saw him, but anyway, so it was quite cute. But
yeah.
um, I became quite suspicious of this dude next to me,
Mm,
and it became quite evident that he was like part of a party, um, and was quite kind of notable in a kind of
mm,
underground, but like known to people in the society in that neighborhood.
mm.
Um, and I don't think he worked. I think he literally just got money from whatever. Anyway, so it reminds me how much like in sectarian parties there is this communalist clientelist system that people benefit from, and that it's less of that same. It's the same logic of it's not about the individual, it's about the community. But then this community is an exclusive explicitly sectarian thing, which each
Yeah,
of its members are quite can be quite shitty.
yeah,
Um, this guy
yeah,
was all but nice to me, but I don't know
yeah.
how to
No, it's a
describe
good
it.
point. Yeah,
There were a few incidences that happened in the neighborhood that made me realize, like, oh,
yeah.
this
Yeah,
dude's
we
like,
should yeah, we should definitely be careful with like putting a rosy colored glass on mutual aid as a thing because yeah, it could be used by those that we would not agree with politically and those who do consolidate power and within their little sub community, they practice this stuff, right?
mm,
But outside it, they don't. And I think that for me, the difference that's where for me as a like someone who engages in anarchist thought and practices, it's be able to move beyond your local community and your local um just your immediate relationships. That like that's how we move beyond the consolidation of power and the scarcity is
mm.
what I'm practicing here with you, my friend, the person I love, my comrade, who I would do anything for. How do I take that and also feel that same way to the stranger next to me and still know that, we're still that deeply connected?
But I think there's a separation between scarcity and domination.
Yeah.
That I think
Yeah.
domination exists even without scarcity. I think that is the
Oh
case.
yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
existed in for a while,
Yeah.
and like increasingly less so. Like that, there's a lie of scarcity.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't
That's
know.
true.
Like I think about these parties, and they're kind of winning. They're fine. They're doing well. And again, not just as parties, but like those sort of individuals that are benefiting from it. And I remember one scene in specific, 7 days into the revolution,
Mm,
when a bunch of like Hezbollah and Amal partisans came down and destroyed the tents we'd built and attacked
mm,
people. And I remember I went back home after that and watching it on TV and seeing this guy just walk up to the riot police, throw a rock, and just walk back because he doesn't give a shit. And again, these are also people who are very connected to the state. That's an
mm-hmm,
important thing in the sectarian system we have. It's not that these are like rogue militias; these are like literally connected to state power. And so,
mm-hmm.
in that sense, it's not mutual aid because it's not actually community. It's community that still has a connection to structures
Right.
of violence.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
but I don't know. I'm also reminded, and I think a lot about the story, even though I haven't read it. I think it's by Le Guin,
Story.
or Ursula Le Guin. What's it called? It's this kind of utopic, dystopic story of like a perfectly well-running society. Everyone's happy, everyone's fine. People are free and liberated and able to say what they want and do whatever, and no one's subject to one another's domination or will, or
Mm-hmm.
no one oppresses each other in
Mm-hmm.
any shape or
Mm-hmm.
form. But then every single night, they all go down to this basement and like smack this kid or something. It's like only, you know what I mean? Like
Scapegoat. This put all the
put it
like,
all on him, but like, is
yeah,
that a this utopic society?
right, right,
And especially in this kind of concept of like the majority who are up there.
right, right.
Um, I'm really
Yeah,
sorry if I got the story wrong because a friend of mine read it and he told me about it, and I get the metaphor, but
yeah.
I really hope anyone who's listening hasn't read the story and is like, "Whoa, you got it completely wrong."
Let us
Um,
know.
Let us know. But I think that the sort of principle still holds in terms of this, um, if it's a utopia, if it's great
Yeah,
for those people, but there is still
yeah.
this subjugation and oppression and whatever. Is it a utopia?
Yep.
Um, and I think that's what a lot of people in the global north um, kind of live within that ignorance and that blissful kind of whatever. Even if
Mm-hmm.
they acknowledge that a lot of the reasons why there is wealth in this continent and why there are so many resources and whatever and all this
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I just don't see enough shame. I don't see enough like sorry, I'm getting into a whole other thing.
I
Um, I have لا لا إنه استحوا. I don't know. I feel constantly thinking about even these little things of this technology that I buy that I if I have to buy,
yeah,
or then constantly the violence of existing within the system and contributing to it and whatever and the structures that exist. I mean, I'm literally living in a country that is supporting the aggression on my home country.
right, right.
Anyway, so all that connects to this greater sense of this sort of another key term is solidarity.
Mm.
Um, and I just
Solidarity, not charity.
oh yeah yeah
Famously.
yeah, it's a good one. But I think in building a kind of cohesive model of mutual aid or of solidarity that is embodied within internationalism, a part of it is again, I just don't see enough of these like conversations.
Yeah,
Um, and so I found myself when we're in the People's Want having some of these conversations and just like they're necessary, but they're very baseline of just getting to
yeah,
know each other. And then
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, no, absolutely right. And like it was shown in that conference in that the first few days were spent listening to each other's struggles, sharing our experiences. And you could tell that there's also a need for us to be engaging in this emotional psychological mutual aid of holding space for each other as we retell our stories because people from what I was witnessing, people wanted to share and they almost didn't know like when to stop, right? Like it was just like, let me tell you everything that had gone down. Let me tell you what, like the whole spiel. And us holding that space for each other and listening to each other, not only are we, it is, it's mutual aid in relationship building and holding space for each other and giving and witnessing each other, but we're also learning what we need. And I mean, we very quickly realized we all need the same thing. And we all have the same, like more or less the same lessons. And we're saying the same things and we're experiencing the same things. And it very quickly turned into like, okay, now what do we need to do?
yeah,
Right. And I mean, there was a very clear point halfway where the conversations shifted and it came from us, the people there, working like holding space together, being in relationship with each other and saying, okay, we got out what we needed to get out. Now let's shift into doing and imagining new.
I do want to give them a bit of credit in terms of the
Oh yeah.
organizers of
Oh yeah, yeah,
what's
yeah.
called
They get well, it's able to do that because of the space they created,
yeah yeah
right?
yeah.
Like and they heard and they moved with us.
And
Yeah.
the people that have been invited over the last 5 years and the sort of like specific
Mm-hmm.
groups and individuals that are willing to have this
Mm-hmm.
conversation and no one was there to like gain social capital or dominate or be like, actually, I have the
Right.
better thing to say.
Right. Right.
Um, Even
Right.
people who were part of the same kind of like contexts.
Right.
But yeah, I think so going back to, I mean, what is mutual aid? And then
Yeah.
all these other terms that we've been talking about with solidarity, or radical politics. If we take that to mean going for the root,
Mm-hmm.
and it's and mutual aid as going like hands-on practice of meeting each other's root needs. Um, well, what are those needs? And so we are like social animals. And so
Mm-hmm.
taking that apart, social, we are in society, we need each other, we like being amongst each other for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Um, all of us have some forms of connections that we like and desire and make us full or whatever in family and friends and the community and like.
Mm-hmm.
And we're living together, and that's what economies are, where it's like moving resources between one another. Um, and how do we move those resources? What are the systems that mediate that? Again,
Mm-hmm.
David Graeber for me is someone that's very important as an
Yeah.
anthropologist and an anarchist. I
Yeah.
don't. He makes that separation, but you see his interest in anthropology, um, with anarchism, with thinking about how were we before the systems we know now that we think of as almost like infinite, but they
Right.
aren't infinite. They weren't always here. And
Yeah.
so his story, for instance, of that he repeats of gifts in
Yeah.
Madagascar, that someone
Yeah.
would a person went to study, and all these people kept giving her gifts, and she didn't know what to do, and finally someone came and like let her in on it, and she's like, "Listen, you're getting a lot of gifts. What you have to do, I'm just going to let you know. People are expecting you to give them gifts back, but
Yeah.
do not give them anything of equal value. Always give them something of lesser or greater value. Because if you give them something of equal value, it's like, oh, that's the relationship,
There's,
goodbye.
yeah.
But if
Yeah.
there's a lesser or equal, and this is in his book Debt, and the idea
Yeah.
that he thinks of like debt as something that's like a constant keeping a glue of society almost. And again, if we're thinking
Yeah.
of like smaller pockets.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we're talking about resources, and some of them are just food, medicine, shelter. These are basic needs that we all need. And so again, it's like a bit boring maybe in comparison to like talking about socialist utopia and like seizing the state and building these infrastructures or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
these, no one can survive without them.
Yeah.
Um, and and so like as animals, as just organisms, these are basic principle, like basic needs.
Yeah.
Um, and without them, there's nothing. There's no socialism. There's no society. There's no anything. And so it's a base thing. Mutual aid as addressing those basic human needs. And again, I think it's important to think constantly in those terms, in terms of needs. Um, because yeah, also there's this whole thing that I find very deeply frustrating of like making things better for those that already have. I mean, how insanely good internet is here, how fast it is. It's just in Europe. It's just, it doesn't need to be this fast. When there
Yeah.
are so many communities who don't have internet,
Yeah.
whose internets are being explicitly blocked by regimes that you are supporting here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something that I wanted to mention earlier, part of the frustration with charities, NGOs, but also in this part of the conversation with a lot of, let's say, leftist organizations, is there's so much capture of energy in those
Mm.
projects and structures that I think are kind of wasted.
Yeah.
Um, in my, if why I include that last part is because some of the organizations or places that I've seen talk so much shit about mutual aid, and there's such like a disrespect for the community that I have no tolerance for. Like I remember being part of a group, I mean, of self-declared anarchists who, when bringing up mutual aid, were like, "We're not a charity,"
Right.
and it's
Right.
like,
Yeah. Yeah. I've had these experiences and I'm just like, we're not the same. I don't know what you're working towards, but clearly we're not working the same thing.
no, 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 and so I don't really care for groups or collectives that it's mostly just about putting out statements or even
Yeah.
just some actions or whatever that don't also have within it a structure of care, even if just for its organizers and its members. Because I mean, I also just see that as something that is unsustainable. It will collapse
Right.
itself, like people will just burn out.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a really good point right there because when we when those in my experience those organizations not only are they erasing the mutual aid and the care work within the movement but within their specific spaces as well, and
Yeah,
so you're expected to sacrifice yourself. You're expected to like, and whether you could withstand the organizing or not, that's on you as a person, not on the collective, right? So it's now a replication of the same individualism and the same power dynamics, because who gets to be the one who has the privilege to sit there and organize for free and go into these meetings long and talk about how we're going to hold up a protest, this and that? It's those of us who have material privilege, right? Who
Yeah.
can take the time off. The rest of us are struggling. So even though we want to be there and we want to organize and we want to push back, we can't because we still have our basic needs, right?
Yeah.
And we need to take care of that. And so you're replicating, you're rupturing the system, and essentially you're killing the movement.
Mm.
We're not moving forward. We're just sitting here, you know? Yeah.
No, and it's even frustrating because I think also it's a place where a lot of reproduction of the
Mm.
same structures happen because we're
Yeah.
very used to having like male leaders,
Yeah. Yeah.
charismatic guys,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
white or whiter complexion, or those that are like well read. So it's like, oh, girl,
Yes.
you haven't read Kropotkin, so like maybe you should sit this meeting out. I'm the one who's going
Yeah.
to dominate the space, and
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, that's why, as I've been saying, the vitalness of centering the needs of those most marginalized within the decision making, within even
Yeah.
the analysis.
Yeah, yeah. They get to choose what they need and they tell us. And like, and ideally we're part of that community. So we have that
Yeah.
understanding. But if you're coming in as a outsider trying to engage with the community, then that's your place to basically be quiet here. And
Yeah,
your role
yeah.
is to figure out how to get them what they need, right?
I mean, for
Not to
my
tell
part,
them, yeah.
for like 2 or 3 years when I started becoming a bit more actively engaged politically, like for most of my life, it was just kind of like reading and scrolling and listening and whatever. But once I started becoming actually like on the ground engaged and like trying to actually whatever, for the
Yeah.
most part, it was just a lot of listening
Yeah, absolutely.
and unlearning. That's like a
Yeah.
huge part, especially as like a cis
Mm-hmm.
guy,
Mm-hmm.
but also as someone from a bougie family, and
Mm-hmm.
also as someone who was very westernized. I mean, I am
Mm-hmm.
in general,
Mm-hmm.
but my
Mm-hmm.
thinking was so much so, like especially at the beginning of the revolution,
Mm-hmm.
there was a kind of feeling, I was like, oh, I don't know anything, you
Mm.
know, like
Mm.
anything that
Yeah.
matters, like all my
Yeah.
Chomsky, all my Said, like it's kind of,
Yeah.
and I love that little bit in this in this film by Edward Said where he goes to Palestine, oh, sorry, southern Lebanon, in a Palestinian
Mm.
camp, and he's sitting with these
Oh, he's
women.
sitting. Yeah. Yeah.
But also he said something around that time where he's like, when he would go, like all of his stuff, all of his like credentials as like a renowned scholar, it didn't matter
Yeah.
because he's here and he's just like, so tell me, you know. So he sort of had to like start from scratch,
Yeah.
which I love, the
Yeah.
humbleness of it, the humility.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I did spend a lot of time, and even now, there are things that I know I shouldn't talk about because I don't know. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
I say enough that it has subverted my understanding of Lebanon by listening to um like trans women, sex workers, people without papers.
Mm-hmm.
But I will never sit here and be like, this is what it's like to be.
Right.
I don't
Right.
know. It's
Right.
enough to say
Right.
that I've definitely been made aware that like so much of my thinking is premised on a Lebanese centric and like male, whatever. But so yeah, I think did we cover? There's obviously still so much to talk about.
Yeah.
I
There's
mean,
always more
practice and
stuff.
theory. We could split this up into 2 episodes and like do another one where it's practice and theory part two,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or this might be sufficient. I don't know. Should we
I
wrap
mean,
up?
yeah, we should definitely wrap up because we're in now over an hour.
Okay.
And um, but I think the practice question is going to keep coming up. And for me, what I want to build on as we move forward is tools and skills that feed into the relationship building and the practices of mutual aid.
Mm,
Um, so, like one example is a comrade and a dear friend, and we engage a lot in somatics with each other. And how do we build capacity to move into, like last time we talked about the vulnerability of this work, and so how do we practice vulnerability? How do we build this in order to uh, build capacity to feel that connection to that stranger the same way I feel connected to you, right? And engage in mutual aid beyond our immediate community to to those that we don't immediately consider one of us. So yeah, I do think this is going to be an ongoing conversation and evolving conversation as we talk to people and we engage with how they see mutual aid and how they theorize around mutual aid and how they practice mutual aid. And I have a hypothesis that as we talk to people, the practice is going to be the theory without even we're going to be talking about theory through the practice. And it's going to be because this is people on the ground engaging in this, doing this, not sitting there reading Kropotkin or whoever else and basically saying, this is the theory and this is how I tried the theory and experimented with theory. It's like, no, this is my lived experience. This is what I'm doing. This is how I'm practicing it. And out of that, I'm learning about what the theory of mutual aid is.
So I think maybe synthesizing a lot of this conversation, what is mutual aid? It is a tool and or a practice that centers the needs of communities that are heavily marginalized by systems of domination that we aim to overthrow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It is choosing to do something now with what you have and with the people that you have, rather than outsourcing and trying to get someone to help you. We're not going to wait around for someone. We're going to do it. We're going to figure it out.
I'm just realizing we didn't use an important term, which I think more is like what that is, direct action.
Yeah, it's true.
So direct action is a very important aspect, and I feel a bit bad that that's coming towards the back end of all this, but it's embedded within all of it.
Yeah, and it's claiming back our power. It's saying, cool, you're not going to do anything. We're going to do it ourselves, and we're going to take care of ourselves, and we're going to rebuild our communities.
Yeah, and a form of resistance.
It is a form of
Because you
resistance.
want us dead, fuck you. No,
Yeah, we will not go down.
No. So, okay. I think that was quite a full episode. I think inevitably it did go out and back in because it's a big topic, but I think we did a good job.
Yeah, I
I
think also
would.
it's how we flow.
It's
Our
how we
brains.
flow. Also, yeah. I mean, shit's fucked. And we are talking from a place of urgency, both of us, but also aware that it's this weird thing. I remember Bell Hooks once saying that it's in her moment of deep crises in her life that that she turned to theory and that theory
Yeah.
saved her.
Yeah, I feel that so deeply in my
But that
soul.
fucks me up because I remember being in deep crisis and being like, I have no time for theory. But then reading Bell Hooks helped me because she was saying, no, actually, theory is what got her out of it. And I'm like, "Tab, I don't get it. Like,
Yeah,
what?
yeah, yeah.
And
No,
so,
yeah, good
no, I mean, just like in our organizing, but also in our thinking of whatever, there's a necessity to be thinking
about theory.
about theory and like theorizing about our practices and the tools that we have in front of us and
Yeah,
what are we doing.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yes, you're right. Like when you're in the heat of it, you can't think about this and you can't theorize and you can't read theory. And also, I'm with Bell Hooks. Finally getting the time to read the theory or taking the time literally saved my life.
Really?
Yeah, literally saved my life. It was what allowed me to recognize I'm not the problem. I live in a system that is doing this. The system is organized in a certain way. And now as I move, it's part of the reason why I'm so meta now. And I'm sure I'm always looking and trying to figure out and what's happening here? What's the undercurrents? What's this? Because we've erased all that and we've put on this nice little screen and everything is pretty, but this stuff is deeply, deeply impacting us. And until we get intentional and we start to weed out these little things and intentionally decide what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and which action we're tactic or strategy or this or that we're going to engage in and for what reason, we're stuck. We're not being proactive in the system that as we engage in it.
Reclaiming our agency.
Right.
Oof.
Right.
Is that a subheader?
Yeah, look at that.
Look at that. I'm also really thinking a lot about reclaiming our sanity,
Yes.
because
Yes.
that's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah.
The psychological warfare of it all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Also part of the mutual aid work we do,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because that's a big problem.
Yep. Yep.
Loneliness and fear and despair.
Isolation. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's all part of it.
And
Yeah.
so I think there's one thing we didn't mention,
Which is
but I'm not going to bring it up as a topic of discussion.
okay.
But this is definitely going to come up in our conversations at some point.
Yeah.
And if future guests listen to this episode before coming on, maybe it's something they bring to the table as well. I think inevitably it's definitely a big one that people talk about, which is the sort of distinction between mutual aid as a tool of survival until capital R revolution,
Mm-hmm.
or as prefigural politics, which creates the lowercase revolution.
Yes.
Both I like, both have elements of naivete,
Yeah.
but I think we need a bit of naivete, or
Yeah.
rather, God knows. But that's definitely an active conversation, or like is things that are within the mutual aid group I'm a part of. That when we have time, we find ourselves going back to that.
Yeah. 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 I
Um,
mean, that's a way for us to keep coming back to the theory, right? Like the prefigurative politics and these ideas that feel really abstract, but tie in to how we are relating and engaging and moving with each other in this moment to try to get us into practice for the world that we're trying to create.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's like a sort of synthesis thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
a bit of both, but that's definitely part of the theory. Is there something
Mm-hmm.
that we're doing as a means to an end, or is it an ends to itself? And I
Mm.
think
Both.
no one, I know, no one engaged in this work doesn't believe it has this desensitized, like, oh, I am helping you so you survive. So when the revolution comes, you can pick up arms. Like, no, I like,
No.
love
Yeah.
forums. It's care. I care
Yeah.
about you. We don't
Yeah.
believe in humans as means.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's it.
Yeah. We
So
will stop there. Yeah.
we will stop there, but all of this is also, I hope, a resource for people. I
Yeah.
also hope it's a invitation to engage in these conversations
Yeah.
with us on Patreon, on the comment section of wherever you're listening to this.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone who perhaps is engaged in similar work and wants to talk with us and be on the podcast, reach out. We should make an email soon, and when we do, it'll be on the show notes,
Yeah.
probably after this episode, because that actually sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
Or if you have someone you'd want to recommend, a book or someone, a writer or a practice or a practitioner, let
Mm-hmm.
us know. And I guess that is the end of this episode.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening. As always, if you like this podcast, please consider supporting it. This podcast is a member of From the Periphery Media Collective, which is a collective of podcasts and other media projects that aims to build internationalist dialogues from below. You can find us on patreon.com/from the periphery. Also have it in the show notes below. If you become a member for as little as $5 a month, you help this podcast grow, you help all the other podcasts and all the other projects in the network grow, and you get exclusive content. You get an
Mm-hmm.
invitation to our monthly hangout, where you can hang out with me and Israa and a bunch of other cool nerds. You get access to my exclusive sub-series, Keep This Between Us, where I tell funny stories, as well as early access to other podcasts and, yeah, other cool shit. So please consider heading on over. And yeah, I think that's it. Israa, that was another lovely episode.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this with me.